Welcome to the Anti-Racism Leadership Institute podcast, where we ignite the sparks of change and inspire a world free of racism. This podcast is dedicated to highlighting the most cutting-edge anti-racist research in education for the purpose of connecting practitioners to powerful research-based approaches to racial equity. I am your host, Dr.Tracey Benson, and today we invite you on a transformative journey as we delve into the efforts and triumphs of those dedicated to fostering racial equity within education. Welcome to the Anti-Racism Leadership Institute Research to Practice podcast. Today, we have the opportunity to talk with Dr. Spencer Salas about his co-authored article, Teachers, Leadership, and Black Boys, Racialized Funds of Knowledge. Dr. Salas is a professor of education in the Department of Middle, Secondary, and K-12 Education at the University of North Carolina at Charlotte, where he leads the PhD in Curriculum and Instruction, Urban Literacies, TESOL Subconcentration. His empirical and theoretical scholarship focuses on the new Latino South and the intersections of Latino immigration with national and regional educational policy and praxis. Welcome to the show, Dr. Salas.
Thank you so much, Tracy. It's great to see you again. I'm excited about the work you're doing.
Likewise. I appreciate you coming to the show. And so let's start off with, why we're here today is to talk about your article. And the reason that we're a research and practice podcast is because we want, educators and education leaders, we have to have access to actual research to implement into practice. And so the reason we interview academics is because we often have the research side that we publish in journals, but yet practitioners don't often access those journals to then translate it into practice. And so your article, Teachers, Leadership, and Black Boys, Racialized Funds of Knowledge, I feel is one in which provides a lot of insight into the environment of being a leader, of a teacher of color. And so can you tell me a little bit about why you chose to co-author this article?
Well, the article's about a teacher who then became a teacher leader, teacher coach. And he was one of the first and only Black male STEM licensure candidates that I ever worked with at UNC Charlotte. So there's a whole lot of literature about why Black males don't enter teaching or why they leave teaching. But there aren't a lot of stories about how it is a Black male comes into teaching and stays and builds a career and goes into the echelons of leadership. So to me, what was really interesting was that he stayed and built a 10-year plus career and went from teacher to teacher coach to educational researcher. So there was a trajectory that we don't see very often. Or that was the motivation to see how was it that he did it. And when we started the piece, I thought of the Harry Potter series, So one of the names for Harry Potter is the boy who lived. So it was sort of the teacher who lived, the Black male teacher who lived and grew a career, not only in teaching, but teacher leadership.
Yeah. So before we get into the content of the actual sort of research article, you've been in teacher education for a while.
Yeah.
And prior to you were actually a practitioner before
Yes.
becoming an academic. And, both being out at UNC Charlotte for 4 years in the leadership development department, and, you're in teacher leadership. And during my time too, there are very few aspiring principals of color that came through the program, given the population of Charlotte. And I understood that that was an issue in teacher preparation as well.
Yes.
What do you think are some of the barriers to entry for teachers of color?
Well, that's what we've been writing about for the last 5 years, and I've discovered a lot of different things. I think first we have to recognize that it wasn't always the case. When I joined DC Public Schools in 1994, the vast majority of the leadership and teachers were Black men and women who were carrying on a tradition of or Black teachers committed to not only DC public schools, but public education more generally. So, but DC public schools was a little bit different than, let's say, a county like Charlotte, Mecklenburg, Cabarrus County, or whatnot. So I think there's always been, this is where the tension is. There's a nostalgia for the Black school teacher or the Black principal or the Black superintendent who really carried a lot of that civil rights movement on his and her on their shoulders. Well, particularly in the South in the rural schoolhouse. But so there's a nostalgia for that because at the current time, you see very few, like you said, black and brown teachers of colors or administrators of colors in North Carolina or nationally. So there's a big disproportionality between what the student body looks like and who the teachers are. So there's a white femininity to K through 12 education. So why is it that black and brown teachers aren't taking up the torch? Well, for black males in particular, the research has theorized that, because potentially they've had very negative experiences in K through 12 public schools as students, that once they're out of school, they don't want to return to school, right? Because they carry the scars of anti-blackness, within their whole being, right? And so school wasn't a happy place, and so why would you want to make a career there? Another piece might be once they're in the classroom or once they do take up teaching, they're often pigeonholed into a certain type of school, a certain type of classroom, and many times those schools or school systems or classrooms are underfunded. They're assigned a sort of policing role or an other fathering role, and they're seen less as teachers and more as an instrument of the disciplinary forces at work at the school, especially in relation to other to black children. Teaching is no longer the default pathway to sort of middle class prosperity, right? So, to a certain extent, there are many more opportunities available. There is a shortage of black and brown teachers, but there's a shortage of teachers, generally speaking, across the board because of the toxicity surrounding the discourse about teachers and teaching and public education, low salary, right? Precarious working conditions and whatnot. So, and all of this is to say, this is why, to me, Ryan Holmes's story really stood out to me. It's like, wow, he not only entered teaching, he stayed in teaching and slowly became a teacher leader in a way that we don't often see.
Yeah, so let's talk about that in terms of Brian Holmes, his trajectory and what you found, and maybe his resilience, right, in a program where he was the only black male
Sure.
in quite some time, and then going into, I'm sure, environments where he experienced some of the phenomena that you've
That's
just
right.
named around. So, what did you find in terms of his experience that gave him
Sure.
sort of the resilience factors to make it through all the different levels
That's
of
right.
education?
Well, to begin, he was born in a very teeny little town, and we're calling it Maryville, South Carolina, population 4,500, which was at one point a crossroads of the tobacco industry. But by the time he was born, it was pretty much a ghost town. And his mother had him very young, in between his junior and senior years. So she was about 16. And a lot of people didn't even know he was born because she had him in the summer and she went right back to school. So he was raised primarily by his mother. So she signed him up for a lot of things, especially because he was only child and she wanted him involved in different things. So, for example, from that very young age, he was placed into situations sometimes where he was the only black child. For example, he remembered he joined the Boy Scouts. It was an all white troop with white leadership. He was one of maybe two black boys, but he really loved it. Or, for example, if his mother heard that, well, Ryan Ryan should be with this teacher. She really intervened to put him in a class with a teacher who would push him and grow his potential and what. So I think,
Gotcha.
but simultaneously, he was in a very segregated small town, as most towns are in South Carolina, right? So he went to a black church. He lived on a black block. The metaphor for or the image we have throughout the article is from a very early age, and he doesn't remember when, but he learned, for example, how to navigate a grocery store parking lot. So if he were returning to his car with his groceries, He'd first stop, take a look. Was anyone parked around the car? Was a white woman parked around the car, getting in and out of her car? And and he'd very gingerly make his way to the car so as not to alarm anyone that he was going to attack her, basically. So he learned that from a very early age, that the way he walked through, navigated a parking lot was important, right?
Right.
And and
And so
so
when I
so
hear you say, and when I intervene, what I hear you say to sort of summarize this for listeners is that he had formative experiences for his own racialization, what it meant to
yes,
be a black person in
a
society.
black
He
man in
understood a
South
black
Carolina.
man. There you go, from the small town experience at a very early age. That he lived a life of segregation in a black community, going to a black church, but he was forced to interact in white space
Yes,
where he understood that his blackness could at times be just perceived as threatening just for being me, right?
yes,
And his mother also understood that she had to be very involved in her
yes,
son's life to make sure that he was with an educator that saw promise in
yes,
him beyond the sort of pejorative tropes of black
exactly.
boys in the classroom.
Yes, exactly. So it was that metaphor of him navigating the parking lot and the white fragility of that parking lot that that we used it as a coding guidepost to look at different moments where he activated this spider sense, or this what we call racialized antennae, or these racialized funds of knowledge. Um, so for example, he entered the classroom, or classroom teaching, but again, in these institutions he was often the only black male, right, with a lot of white female colleagues. And then when he became a teacher coach, he was again the only black male working with a lot of white women. So for example, when he would go to visit a school to do professional development, he had to dress up, over prepare, and part of it was his own southernness, but sort of charm and sweet talk, and put everybody at ease when he entered that cafeteria full of white women. But at the same time, he was super prepared for the professional development he was going to deliver. And so that's what we've followed across the course of his career, is these instances where he took what he had learned in that parking lot and then applied it into um, K through 12 teaching and new teacher coaching.
Right. And I asked him a question about sort of the importance of racialization, especially. So it sounds like it was very strong for him in terms of understanding his identity and role to be successful and taken as someone of merit, being a black man in education, and also have sort of the protective understanding that in order to be received in a way that maybe a white counterpart would be received, I have to sort of be hyper prepared because there's less than an expectation for me to lead because they might not see me having the capacity. And so it reminds me of this movie. It's hilarious, right? But it talks about this very phenomena. You should watch it. It's called the American Society of Magical Negroes, and it talks very much about this, about how being a black person in particular, how we have to make white people comfortable in predominantly white spaces, right? And it's throughout, it's a through line through the movie. It's done in a comical sense, but it's a very real lived reality. And so do you remember any particular examples he gave, either from his teaching career or his progression into leadership, that you use in the research around, where he talks about having to being aware that this racial phenomena was
Yeah.
acting upon him, and how did he respond?
Sure. Well, for example, a lot of as part of a new, so there was a new teacher coaching network that's part of the story too. Overnight, it sort of folded, but he served like a 200 square mile region, and that would involve him driving several hours to a very rural county to deliver PD, and then to return the next day and continue it for several days. But what was interesting was that, he never spent the night. So I was like, why don't you just spend the night there? The problem was, as soon as he entered that main street, he felt unsafe. He was the only black man in town, and he really didn't want to spend the night in that space. So he would prefer to drive back. They always went in pairs, right? They had the option to spend the night in a hotel and whatnot. They never they never opted for it because there was something that wasn't safe in a lot of these towns. And in another instance, he described how he started before he even started the PD. They're all settling down, so the principal makes some announcements. Basically, the principal announced to everybody and nobody that we don't really need you here. I didn't ask for this, but we're just going to sit through it. So it was that sort of which really undermines any presenter or anything like that. He just smiled and carried on. We asked him, so why did you stay? If it was all of that. And he felt that he wasn't just doing it for himself, but for the next generation of black male teacher leaders. The way we end the piece, it's right when we were finishing the piece, there was a song that came out on the country billboard. I think it's called Try That in a Small Town.
Yes,
It was
I
sort
wrote
of
that
a
song. Yeah.
white nationalist anthem about, better be careful coming around here. And this is what we do to people that cross the line in a small town. And the refrain is try that in a small town, try that in a small town. And this was not much, just a couple of years after the shootings in South Carolina. The jogger was going through the neighborhood, was shot down by a brother and his father from a pickup
Yes.
truck.
Yes.
So we end with that. But at the same time, what he heard, Ryan Holmes heard, was a choir of black boys, mothers reverberating across his whole being to never let go, to never give up that seat of the table.
Let me pause you because I want to think about this, right, in terms of the context for responsibility for sort of the education sector in general. So I want to talk about pre-service, at service, right, and then leadership. Because I know that, at UNCC, there's a teacher development program. And we have, like you said, we have students from all races and backgrounds that come into this space. And there's a certain level of, from my perspective, responsibility of schools of education to not only understand the role of teachers of color in the context that they're going into when they work in these spaces, right, the predominantly white female spaces, but also be able to have the white women who come in develop some level of racial awareness themselves so that they can be aware of trying not to create that environment for educators of color. And so how does that look at UNCC, or how do you think it should look?
I can't remember when they started, but they've done a lot more in terms of recruitment of Latinx teachers right now. The last 5 years, there's been a big. That was something Jim Watson. I don't know if you remember Jim, but he started a whole Latinx teacher to teacher leader pipeline. So they have cohorts of principal candidates coming in that are Latinx, and I think that in the past, and this is one of the reasons, we were sad to see you go, but we had some great faculty, black male faculty, right? Who trained generations of black male leaders. So we haven't had someone fill in. I'm thinking of there's a colleague who he retired right when I arrived, but we had several colleagues who really had who trained a lot of superintendents in the state of North Carolina. But since they've gone, in the end, I think that it's helpful to have faculty of color.
Gotcha. So what I heard you say is more sort of differences in not just color, but epistemologies, that
Right.
folks who've been through the system as a leader of color to have that actual experience, incorporate that into their pedagogy.
Right.
Not just for the candidates of color, but I think it's equally as important for the white candidates to
Well,
understand.
I mean, I have to say too that, it's not just at UNC Charlotte, but just about everywhere. Everything's become so data driven. I mean, in other words, it's become very assessment driven, data driven, or sort of the science of leadership. So I don't know to what extent we're addressing those things. And I can say that, with the positions that the Board of Governors has taken on institutional neutrality, I'm not sure how we'll continue to address these important issues. That's for sure.
Yeah, so let's transition to ad service because as you sort of said in terms of the ranks in higher education around diversifying the professor ranks. There's a lot of calls. So in my work, my anti-racist work, with a lot of school districts, so they understand that their deficit is that they have students of color, percentages of students of color within their school district or in their schools, but yeah, an absolute lack of a pipeline of teachers of color, or they have a revolving door where they bring in a few, stay a few years, and they leave. Right. And their strategy continues to be, well, let's just try to diversify, just push the brown folks into the positions, and that's going to fix the problem, which hasn't been working. And so what advice do you have for school districts who continue to have this
Well,
carousel of teachers, considering that you did some deep research around the experience
yeah.
of this black male when he was at practice?
Well, I think long term, immediate and long term mentoring is really important. Okay, especially in a small town or big town, in the South at least. I think there's still a big old boy network in K through 12 public school systems. And so many times, first securing the job is dependent on you knowing someone within the school system that can recommend you. And so that's what I've seen first of all. So if you're coming from outside, you don't already have that network of friendships, right? Um, or mentorship. So I think you need short and long term commitment to mentoring. I think you need short and long term career advancement opportunities where they're mentoring them not only, so the mentor is not just the K through the pedagogical piece, but the career planning, work life balance, and also opportunities for advancement. So yeah, I think that's what's really necessary.
Gotcha.
Yeah, especially if they're coming from the outside.
So what I
If
heard you
they're
say
not
is,
a local hire.
yeah, what I heard you say is one, entry, right? Because it's still a lot of like nepotism. Like you got to know somebody to even get a job,
I
right?
think so. Unless the school system is super duper desperate for a teacher.
Right, right. Yeah,
And also
like
here's the thing, right? That I learned from these articles is that these interview studies is like, well, a black woman or black man can't just teach anywhere, you know, because there's a safety issue, right? Or
Mhm.
that it would be a place where they could live and work and feel safe, especially living in the place, right? So, a lot of these counties and towns were historically what we call sundown towns or sundown counties. There's white only. Everybody had to clear out. If you were black, you had to clear out after at sundown or really risk your life. And so, there is a huge shortage of teachers in rural North Carolina, but a lot of black teachers would not be interested in working there because of safety issues,
Interested
right?
or welcome, right? There
Yeah,
is that issue that you're the first black teacher or your first
yeah,
leader teacher of color in any probably all white setting. I don't know how those parents going to feel.
exactly.
Feel having
Yeah,
your child in that class, assuming that the teacher's not as qualified or what might be indoctrinating my kids because you're a person of color. You have all these extra pressures because of the assumptions of a person of color being the first in a space, so it
yeah.
might not be welcome at all.
So then you have other school districts where and this is what I've seen. If it's a well functioning school that's well funded with great leadership, teachers don't want to leave. And it's really hard to enter those schools. So a lot of the openings are in underfunded schools with revolving door leadership, with his different issues surrounding student achievement or school climate or school leadership. I think another challenge that I'm seeing too is that with that movement towards standards-based curriculum, there, especially with the new teachers, there's a lot more emphasis on them developing curriculum. Okay, so for example, they're just not handed the curriculum and the lesson plans and this sort of thing, but they're expected just to develop it. And so I think, especially for those first couple of years, maybe somebody needs to really hand them a template that they can follow so that they're not expending so much energy planning an entire curriculum when they're available, right? And maybe if they were made available to those teachers, that they could concentrate on the delivery, on the classroom environment. I'm
Yeah,
not sure.
that was my experience as a first year teacher. I started teaching in Houston, Texas, and I was in one of these schools with a lot of needs. 100% of my students were on free and reduced lunch. I had some homeless students. I had some transient students. I taught in a portable building out back because the school had become too small within the building to hold everyone. I think I had 30 students on average. And it was a situation where I was provided with what was called Project Clear. And that was awesome that we had the standards, we had this, standardized tests, which, it doesn't matter if you agree with it or not. But we had a scope and sequence with the lesson by lesson. And that
Yeah,
changed my experience as a first year teacher. After that, I started writing my own curriculum. For the first
yeah,
2 years, when you're learning to teach, it's an invaluable
for sure.
resource. And what you're talking about too, in terms of these environments, like who's hiring where, and when we think about the desirable schools, right? Because we've done that as a system in America, that we have these schools that they're deemed, A, top level schools that teachers want to come and stay. That there's not a lot of turnover, and when positions do open up, they tend to lean towards recruiting more of what was there, which is often white teachers,
Yeah.
and then a
Or friends
closed
of
door.
friends. Yeah.
Yeah, to the
Friends
to
of
the
friends.
black teacher, and so I started a research project right before I left UNCC with Rich Lambert, using a big data set on where do black teachers teach, and we saw far and wide because we organized uh, the racial concentrations into quartiles, right? And then we looked at the socioeconomic status of the schools, the turnover rates, the funding sources, and in the fourth quadrant, which was amongst the most highest need schools, that's where you found your teachers and leaders of color.
Yes.
And so,
And I mean, well, so for example, Ryan Holmes was certified to teach STEM, and he couldn't understand, and he faced a lot of pushback when he asked to teach. Let me teach the AP class. Let me teach the gifted class. Do you see what I mean? So it's like, no, 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 no. You teach, more of this remedial, lower tract course with the black children, and we'll find someone else to do the AP International Baccalaureate STEM curriculum that's more qualified. And the implication was, well, because he was black, he was less qualified. He couldn't handle that curriculum on the one hand, or because he was black, then he really needed to be with the black kids, and so he could police them.
right, is that double edge right there too, right? Is that we also have school districts say that we need more kids of color in the AP and honors and IB courses, but yet we know very well that there's tracking. That we tend to expect students to be in these low level courses. Hence, you black teachers, that's where you go. That's where you
Yeah.
stay. So thinking about, and this is something that I had to do with my first book, which is now why I do what I do. We run the Anti-Racism Leadership Institute. We wrote the book for the hope of influencing many leaders. It became really popular, and folks wanted to then. So what now, right? We read the book, we understand the sort of tenets, but we don't know how to actualize it. And so I asked this question. I tried to ask it of all the guests. So at the article that we talked about today, Teachers, Leadership, and Black Voice Racialized Funds of Knowledge, if this was something that school districts chose to do a reading on, as a district, from the teachers to the leaders, around the tenets of the article and what you have found. What would be your hope following sort of a study of your study? What would your hope be that would, in terms of practices they could glean from your article and implement for themselves?
Well, I think my biggest hope with this piece and the series I've done is that for example, the ones we did together, right, is that we would create spaces for Black and brown teachers to share their experiences. And I think sometimes, at least for me, it's really powerful to hear the individuals share how they came to this place and what were some of the obstacles, what they feel could have helped them, or what they want to give forward or pay forward. So I think my biggest hope is that create a space where especially Black and brown teachers and teacher leaderships can share their stories. Yeah. And just that's a starting point for change. I think just hearing those experiences. So that's been my motivation, is just to document some of them. And, each one is such a different experience, right? And that is also the limitation of my research. It's qualitative, it's very small study. So it's more meant to disrupt or
Yeah.
or create spaces for thinking maybe in different ways. Yeah.
And what I appreciate about your work, this article and also the article that we did together, and some of your other articles, is just bringing another the life that has always existed for leaders of color. It's always existed, but bringing this as a narrative to understand that teaching and education in general is a racialized space. It's not. It
Yeah, and
doesn't exist in
stories
a
are
vacuum.
powerful. That's what I would say. Stories are
Yeah.
powerful.
And my hope with your work, and constantly elevating the voices of teachers of color, as well as Ryan, right? His drive to be called beyond the now, towards making a space for people like him in the
Right,
future, that we won't have to have this spidey sense or antennae or act differently in the
right.
space because of our racial identity. So that's the hope that I see in elevating these narratives and these stories, is that becomes a part of the consciousness that maybe one day it's no longer necessary. I don't think it's going to happen in our lifetime, but
Yeah. Do you
maybe.
feel that way, Tracy, when you navigate a parking lot or a space? Do you?
It's and when you say that, like, I think most brown males can understand that. Like, that's just
Right,
how we operate. If there's a car next to mine, right, and there's a white woman getting in, I'm gonna wait until she's in her car, right, and then I'm gonna approach very gingerly to put my stuff in the trunk and then make my way to my door, because if I approach
yeah,
too fast, she's gonna get all freaked out. It's not like
yeah, yeah,
anything's going to happen, but just the response of fear in and of
right.
itself is
Yes.
traumatizing, as often as it happens. So it's very
And where
familiar.
did you learn that?
It's interesting. I mean, we sort of pick it up over time. I think you pick it up over a response. The first time it happens, it's like, whoa, like I wasn't trying to do that as maybe a teenager, right? Because at some
Yeah,
point you become a threatening black male, right?
yeah,
You're no longer that little boy. You start getting these reactions and responses to white society. And I think it's through trial and error and discussion it with your parents, discussing it with your friends, and we're like,
yeah.
yeah, this is happening, right? And you learn how to
That's
what.
it. That's exactly how Ryan Holmes explained it. And I also add that it was so normalized in this small town in North Carolina that that's just the way things were. So he was never sort of outraged or shocked by the racism that he encountered. It was just that's just the way things were.
And I think that's
It's
unfortunate that
just
it had.
unfortunate. Like,
Yeah,
but
that
yeah,
it has to be. And I think that teacher preparation programs, I think that ad service programs could acknowledge that in a way that it acts as a protective measure, because not everyone who's of color understands the difference between I'm between this way because of my color, opposed to I'm between this way because I actually have a lack of capacity, right? And I
well,
think that
here's
produces
something
that
too
that
that is
schism.
the challenge for teacher education and in service, at service teacher education. I'm be interested to hear how you deal with that or address it. Is that also because of those experiences when you have a class and you bring up these topics surrounding race and gender, it's not as if the black males are really eager to speak up, or anybody really is not interested in speaking up because it is just exposing yourself to another potential aggression, right? So, but then a lot of times when we talk about diversity in teacher education, the audience is a default white female. So it is even. So when you do have the one black male teacher or two, several teachers of color within that group, it's really not been designed for them. Do you see what I mean? So how do you handle that?
I think that is a wonderful question to leave hanging out there. I think that's where we have the trouble. That's what we have to think about, right? That the traditional sense of let's diversify so these can be the representative hasn't worked, right? Because it's a hostile space to those students of color, right? They have to be the representative. They have to absorb the white fragility. They have to absorb the doubts, the questioning, and making their classmates uncomfortable. So thinking through, like, what does that look like exactly in terms of curriculum, and how we build that for everyone, and not just have the students of color be the representative,
When we craft the story for the manuscript, it's really an uninterrupted story. So, we have access to that story in ways that if you were in a PD session, it's not the same individual might not necessarily share any of that, right? But in that privacy of the interview, and then in the artistry of the manuscript, you can convey some of that experience in a way that, the white listening subject could then sit down and read it closely and think about it without feeling the need to respond to the participant, maybe let it settle in. So I think that's maybe one of the reasons I've enjoyed writing the pieces. In any event, like I said, stories matter. And
Awesome. Awesome. And I really appreciate your level of work, your dedication to it, your choice to write these type of articles. And I'd like to thank you for coming today. This has been the Anti-Racism Leadership Institute Research to Practice podcast with Dr. Spencer Salas. He's at University of North Carolina at Charlotte. You can just Google him, right? Find him and his litany of work and a lot of these really powerful articles that he writes all the time. And I really appreciate you coming on today, Dr. Salas, and I hope to get together again in the future.
Thank you, Tracy. Have a great school year.
Thank you for tuning in to this episode of the Anti-Racism Leadership Institute podcast. Remember, the fight against racism starts with each and every one of us. Together, we can create inclusive environments in our schools that celebrate diversity and empower all students. For more information, visit our website at antiracisminstitute.com and subscribe to our channel. Join us next time as we continue to shine a light on the champions of change. Stay inspired, committed, and let's make a difference together.